On today's show, the latest reports and speculation on contract extensions for both Kevin Durant and Tari Eason. Why the Rockets may not be feeling pressured to extend KD this summer. Plus, what's the right number for Tari's next deal? It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What is up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform you're choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. On today's show, we're getting into the latest reports and speculation about the final two dominoes of this Houston Rockets offseason, the possible extensions for both Kevin Durant and Tari Eason. We'll take a look at why the Rockets may not be feeling pressured to come to terms on a KD extension this summer, and what the right number is for a Tari Eason rookie scale contract extension, and kind of why maybe they haven't struck a deal quite just yet, at least not as quickly as they did with Jabari Smith Jr. First, I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Football season is around the corner. Visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets now. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Let's start with the KD stuff first, because we had a report from ESPN from Tim McMahon on the Hoop Collective podcast talking about the Rockets and the Kevin Durant contract situation. Let's go ahead and throw it out. We'll run that audio back and then we'll talk about it.
The Rockets aren't going to go all in by all appearances. And by what I've heard, they're not going all in on an extension for Kevin Durant. Now, doesn't mean it won't happen, but, there've been rumblings of, hey, KD doesn't, he's not going to push for the full max. I don't know that the Rockets are going to put anything on the table that's close to the max. I think the Rockets are it's not ideal, but I don't think they would panic if they go into the season with Kevin Durant just on the contract that he's on, just on the expiring.
Okay. So to unpack that, first and foremost, I want to highlight here that, in the lead up to the Kevin Durant trade, the teams that were all involved in this KD sweepstakes, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that, okay, if KD gets dealt to one of his, quote unquote, preferred destinations, that he would land there and then subsequently ink that 2-year maximum extension, which is like 2 years, like approximately $121 million or something. And that seemed kind of like a foregone conclusion. Like, okay, you're not trading for KD on a 1-year deal. You're trading for KD and he's going to sign, at least like an extension, like a 1+1, one more guaranteed year, and then maybe a player option that final year. So you get at least 2 to 3 guaranteed years of Kevin Durant, because that's always the risk that you run when you trade for a player with 1 year left on their contract. It's kind of a, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, you've got to, have the confidence that that player wants to be in your city, that player wants to play for your organization, or you run the risk of that player just bouncing after 1 year, right? Similar to what happened with Kawhi Leonard and the Toronto Raptors, right? The Raptors ran that risk. They traded for Kawhi. They won a title, and then Kawhi bolted, right? Went to the Clippers. So I don't think that's what's happening in this situation with the Rockets and KD, but it feels a little funky, because at the end of the day, you would like to have that peace of mind. I'm sure Rockets fans would love to have that peace of mind of just, okay, cool, KD's committed, he's locked in, he wants to be here long term. He's, the Rockets have a window of 2 to 3 years where KD's under contract, and they've got him till he's 39 or 40 years old, whatever it may be. And yes, there was a little bit of reporting out there that suggested previously that KD might be willing to accept less than his maximum contract salary in order to maybe help facilitate, some roster construction, or, maybe making it a little bit easier on the Rockets down the line with some of the payroll implications that they're going to have, needing to pay the young guys like Jabari Smith Jr., who they already inked to his rookie scale extension. They still need to figure out Tari's rookie extension, which we'll be talking about a little bit later in the show. And And then also the fact that they've got, what is likely to be a rookie scale max extension coming down the pipeline for Thompson. So I don't think that this is necessarily anything bad on the surface. Like, I don't think there's like any level of like KD's a little worried. Like, KD wants to make sure that the Rockets are good before he commits long-term, or the Rockets want to make sure that, KD isn't, going to have a major injury, or they want to make sure that KD fits with everybody else before they commit to him long-term. I don't think it's that whatsoever. It just kind of feels like both sides more or less doing their due diligence, right? In particular, from the Rocket side of things, because we have this track record, right? There's precedent from Rafael Stone and the Rockets front office that they don't just throw out contracts willy-nilly. Any other team in the association might have just walked up to Alperen Sengun and been like, you know what? Rookie scale max deal. You were awesome in year 3. We see you becoming a blossoming all-star. Here's your rookie scale max. Cool. Instead, Rafael Stone did his due diligence. He looked at the market and he held, Alperen Sengun, kind of held his feet to the fire a little bit, and he got him on, a relatively bargain contract for being one of the, arguably top 5 centers in the NBA at just 23 years old. So, 22 at the time of signing the contract. And so this is just another in a long line of Rafael Stone making sure that he gets maximum value in these contract negotiations, finding a way to, and again, if you can get KD to sign for, an extension for 2 years, 100 million instead of 2 years, 120 million, right? He maybe sacrifices 10 mil a year, something like that. That suddenly puts the Rockets in a much more advantageous position as far as their cap maneuverability and any, potential luxury tax penalties further down the line. Elsewhere in this Hoops Collective podcast, Tim Bontemps kind of talked about, the Rockets' financial perspective of this, and he had this to say. The Rockets have done an outstanding job of understanding the new economic environment that the league is in. Teams have to be much better about negotiating every dollar on deals. As we've seen over the past couple of years, deeper teams are probably going to have more success with where the league is headed. You have to mind your P's and Q's when it comes to these contracts and not be giving out extra money on deals to where you wind up in the second apron sooner and you have all these difficult financial questions. The Rockets have done a remarkable job of showing fiscal discipline and restraint all the way through. And I think if they can continue to do that, they're going to have a real advantage over the competition, because we've seen other teams not do that. And I think it's going to bite them later. So to me, this discussion about why the KD extension hasn't happened yet, why the Rockets are maybe even comfortable with it, being pushed later into either into the season or even just revisiting the conversation entirely next offseason, is because they're okay with taking a more cautious approach to the finances. And at the end of the day, even if they kick the can down the road and they decide they want to renegotiate with KD next offseason, there are actually a ton of benefits that really play into the Rockets' favor, not necessarily KD's, but certainly help the Rockets a ton if they wait on a KD extension. And we'll talk about those reasons coming up here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live for bold predictions and preseason hunches. For just 24 hours, one day only, FanDuel is giving you deals on NFL season predictions. So whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing a long shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champ before week 1 even kicks off, this is your moment. Maybe you think the Texans are going to be division winners. You could throw some money on that, or just take a look at the outright favorites to win the Super Bowl this upcoming season. There's a 3-way tie at the top of the pecking order between the Bills, the Ravens, and the Eagles, all plus 700. Right behind them, you have the Chiefs at plus 850, the Lions at plus 1,000, and then in distant 6th place, the Washington Commanders at plus 2,000. So for all those odds and so much more, visit the FanDuel app today and start planning your futures bets right now, because Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, I do want your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts, your concerns, your worries maybe about the Kevin Durant extension discussion in the YouTube comments. But here's where I'm kind of sitting and looking at this situation from the KD side of things, right? There's obviously the benefit of, okay, cool, you got traded to Houston. Yeah, you're excited about it. They're a young, talented roster, defensive minded, a lot of depth. And there should be, it should be a perfectly happy marriage. It should work out really well. And the Rockets have as good a chance as any to potentially dethrone the Thunder this upcoming season and actually win a title. So from the KD perspective, right, the Rockets seem like a great fit of an organization, but it's also not, without its question marks, right? The Rockets were a 2 seed last season, but maybe they overachieved a little bit. There's still concerns about the offense. Obviously, KD is not going to, squash all of the offensive woes of this team by himself. He'll certainly help a ton. And I think the Rockets will easily be a top 5 or arguably top 3 defense this upcoming season, as well as a top 10 offense with the addition of KD and some additional shooting for Dorian Finney-Smith and, regression to the mean for guys like Jabari Smith Jr. and Fred VanVleet, things like that. But from the KD side of things, maybe he doesn't want to be locked in to a long-term contract in Houston, right? Maybe for KD, he gets an audition season, right? Where he gets 1 year with no pressure of, the additional years 2 and 3 on an extension of, okay, he's, trapped in Houston for the remainder of his career, that kind of thing, or in a situation where he would have to demand another trade somewhere down the line, which these are all like, absolute worst case scenarios kind of thing. But those would be, I guess, that would be the only benefit for KD, right? To not have that contract extension, to have the optionality to leave Houston after this season if things go sideways. The downside, though, right, is KD, he's going to be 37 when the season starts. He's had an injury history. Not that I'm saying not that I think he's going to suddenly regress, but like if he does regress a little bit, right, if his numbers don't pop the way they did this past season, if he does take a step back in his efficiency, his scoring output, whatever, if he doesn't look like a top 10 player still this season, then maybe that gives the Rockets even more negotiating leverage for that next contract next summer, right? So that's actually a point in favor of the Rockets. That's a downside for KD if he doesn't sign the extension this offseason. From the Rockets' perspective, the only fear, right, is if you don't lock in KD this summer, then yeah, he could bolt next offseason. And if there's a team with max salary space that wants to sign KD and wants to take a flyer on, at that point, 38-year-old KD to take him somewhere, then they could do that, right? And KD could leave next summer. And the Rockets would have then dealt Jalen and Dylan and a number 10 overall pick and a bunch of second rounders for 1 season of Kevin Durant. And I think that on the surface, right, unless you somehow win a title with that 1 season with KD as like your hired gun, your mercenary to bring him in, he brings a title and then he bounces, like, again, similar to Kawhi Leonard. Unless that happens, then I think you view that trade as a catastrophic failure, right? That's a gigantic mistake. So that's the one major concern for the Rockets if you don't lock in KD. But the benefits feel like they kind of outweigh the concerns. Because again, if you're the Rockets and if you feel like there's even a remote possibility that you can save money long-term by waiting on a KD extension, either by, waiting him out and pressing him about it, or if you just want to navigate through the regular season and see how things look, because at the end of the day, on paper, the KD acquisition makes perfect sense. And on paper, it should all work out. But maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe KD doesn't fit with the young guys, or maybe Alperen Sengun takes another step forward. Thompson takes another significant leap forward. And maybe you feel really good about those 2 guys being the torchbearers for your team. And you kind of feel like you've moved on past KD. Maybe you don't realize that, or maybe you get into this season and KD, this would be a complete shock, but maybe KD isn't the team's best player this next season. Maybe it's still Sengun because he levels up again, or maybe it's Thompson because he catapults himself into, one of the best player in the league conversation in just year 3, because of that's how good he has a chance to be as a player. If any of those kind of things come to fruition, then do the Rockets really want to be on the hook for 2 more years of Kevin Durant making, $60 million a year, or even north of $50 million a year, if they really feel like they can contend at the highest level with Amen and Alp as their 2 best players? And then maybe they'd be better off utilizing that money elsewhere to bolster the roster, to improve other positions, to add more depth, to add a player that better complements Sengun and Amen. Again, this is all I'm just trying to throw out every possible permutation of why this KD stuff is maybe potentially being put on the back burner if you're the Houston Rockets, because at the end of the day, it is strange, because you would think that both sides would want that peace of mind, that assurance that they're committed, at least for the next couple of years, next 2 to 3 years, and knowing that that's the direction that the franchise is going in, rather than this kind of lame duck situation where KD comes in and he has to prove that he's still a top 10 player, and he has to prove that he can still be the best player on a contender before the Rockets commit that 2-year extension to him and say, you know what? Yeah, we don't see any signs of you slowing down. We still think you can be a top 10, top 15 player for the next couple of years. Here's your bag, 2 years, 100 million, 2 years, 110 million, whatever it may be, whatever potential discount KD is willing to give back in these discussions. But yeah, that's kind of the crux of it, is just the Rockets have to have this gigantic kind of balancing act between what they're willing to pay right now and the cost of putting together a title contending team right now with KD as their best player, versus the long-term ramifications of potentially signing KD that 2-year extension, and how that impacts the team and its ability to field a competitive roster once the other salaries start kicking in, right? Once the extension for Jabari kicks in, once the possible extension for Tari kicks in, once the extension for Thompson kicks in, all these different concerns. And so I just think it's the Rockets doing their due diligence. And at the end of the day, I hope they're able to come to terms on a deal. That would be my preferred outcome, is to be able to, report on and talk about a successful Kevin Durant extension this offseason. But there is no denying that there are benefits, seemingly, for the Rockets to delay these extension negotiations until, midway through the season, possibly, or even, all the way until next offseason, after they know what 1 year of KD and this Rockets partnership ultimately looks like, and what direction the organization is headed, how much better Sengun gets, Amen gets, Jabari, Tari, what Reed Sheppard looks like, all that kind of stuff. So that's it for the KD side of things. For the Tari Eason stuff, the Tari Eason one's a little bit more peculiar to me, and in part because, I kind of assumed, incorrectly so, more on that in a second, but I kind of assumed that when the Rockets offered Jabari Smith Jr. his contract, that they probably offered both Jabari and Tari contracts at the same time. And my understanding of the situation is that they prioritized getting Jabari Smith Jr. taken care of first and foremost, right? He was the number 3 overall pick. They wanted to make sure that he was, settled in, that they got him under, on a good contract, and that they just wanted to take care of that first this offseason, and that the Tari situation is something that they're dealing with ongoing, right? It's not something that they handled at the same time. It's not like the Jalen Green, Alperen, Sengun situation, where those two contracts were very intertwined, right? Because of locker room politics, and you couldn't really, even though Sengun absolutely earned his extension, right? You couldn't just give Sengun the extension and not give Jalen Green the extension because of the politics of Jalen Green was the number 2 overall pick and Sengun was the middle first round pick, and Sengun outplayed Jalen Green, but do you want to mess with Jalen Green's confidence by making him be go in, as a restricted free agent in the final year of his rookie deal, all these different things, at the end of the day. And so my understanding of the situation is that the Rockets viewed and handled these situations separately of one another, right? They viewed the Jabari contract as one thing, and they're viewing the Tari Eason contract as a completely separate ordeal. And so obviously the Jabari Smith Jr. contract has been inked, signed. It's all good. The ink is dry. It's been dry on the page for a little while. And so we can use that, or maybe we shouldn't use that, but I guess it can be used as a potential point of reference when we start to take a look at the Tari Eason contract and what would be a fair number for Tari Eason's rookie scale contract extension. That's what we're going to talk about here coming up in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, let me dive into a little bit of a breakdown that former NBA front office executive John Hollinger did about the Tari Eason situation. I want to read what Hollinger wrote first for The Athletic. and then we'll talk about what he had to share about the Tari Eason situation. For starters, the Rockets may have inadvertently set the bar for Eason when they did Smith's deal. Given that Eason is a better player, it seems like Smith's deal, 5 years and $124 million, should be Eason's floor. Of course, realists will note the true question is what the market will ultimately pay. While Eason's hyperactive defense and aggressive transition play make him valuable, his half-court offensive limitations likely put a cap on his future paydays, similar to how it would be for Atlanta's Dyson Daniels. The second issue here is the presence of both Smith and, more importantly, Durant. Those two likely conspire to keep most of Eason's minutes from being at his best position, power forward, and instead push him into wing roles that tax his offensive skill set and thus may make him look worse when he hits the market next summer. Board has a $21.7 million annual valuation on Eason, partly because his recent health track record has been shaky. But even if the Rockets and Eason had a workable number, say 3 years for $65 million to $70 million, another issue crops up. The Rockets might not want to commit to paying him yet. Houston has multiple decisions on whom to pay in coming seasons, and the Rockets will be particularly expensive in 26-27 and 27-28, regardless, assuming Durant signs an extension. Because of that, one wonders if Houston might choose to strategically cash in their Eason stock before next season, and if so, whether that would be more easily accomplished without an extension. All right. That's a lot to unpack there. First off, the very first line of that article, I don't necessarily think that it's a given that Tari is better than Jabari Smith Jr. I think they're on the same tier, and I think they both have their respective strengths and weaknesses of their game. I think that probably on a per minute basis, like just especially when you look at some of the impact metrics, advanced stats, that kind of thing, I think that Tari is probably the more impactful player at this stage. But given Jabari's versatility, given how seamlessly he plugs into multiple different lineup permutations, right? That you can run him as a small ball 5, you can slot him all the way down at the 3. He provides more reliable floor spacing than Tari, and still feels like there's a lot to, that we've only barely scratched the surface of Jabari's offensive repertoire and some of the things that he can probably do operating out of the elbow, facing up, getting to some of his post-up game, things like that. Whereas Tari is that chaotic, defensive playmaker. You inject him into the game and he provides that burst of energy, can completely change the flow and complexion of a game coming off the bench, that kind of thing. I don't know that one is necessarily flat out better than the other. That being said, Jabari's deal, 5 years, $124 million, does provide a little bit of a baseline for what I'm sure Tari and his representation are using as, their kind of negotiating chip to be like, okay, well, you guys paid Jabari this. We feel like Tari's worth at least that amount. And then the Rockets now have to go back and forth. And this is where, Rafael Stone, being, the lawyer that he is and always trying to find a good deal, is definitely using probably every bit of ammunition that he has in order to try and get Tari on a more team-friendly kind of contract. So I will say, first and foremost, the idea of the Rockets, I guess, cashing in their Eason stock, I really cannot see the Rockets letting go of Tari Eason. They love Tari. Tari loves Houston. The relationship is great. It kind of just feels like one of those situations where both sides are, again, having to do their due diligence. Tari and his representation want to get him paid the absolute maximum amount of money that they can get him paid. The Rockets are able to use examples like this past season of Tari being, still limited because of the injury from a year ago, not playing on back-to-backs, having to load manage his minutes, having to be careful with his minutes, output earlier in the season, as well as, him missing, so much of his second year in the NBA. There are significant concerns, right? Tari's missed a chunk of his NBA career so far, unfortunately. Now, granted, it was kind of a freak injury, weird situation with the leg and the tumor and all that. So, with all that being said, is it fair for Rafael Stone to hold that against him? Probably not. But at the same time, it's Rafael Stone's job to get the best possible deal. And knowing that you're going to have to pay, guys like Thompson further down the line, and knowing that guys like Jabari and Tari are more of your, they're your role players, right? They're not the stars. They're not the guys that are the engines that are going to be running this team. So you want to get those guys on, as close to team-friendly kind of contracts as you can get them. for Tari, Jabari is making a little over, $20 million per year annually on his extension. 5 years, $124 million. So he's making, it's like 23.3 or something a year. For Tari, I feel like that number has to be at least similar to Jabari's, but the problem herein lies, can the Rockets get him on a deal that's slightly cheaper than Jabari's, right? Can you get Tari to commit to 5 years, $100 million, 5 years, $120 million? Maybe you do less years, maybe you do 4 years only, and you do 4 years, 4 years, $80 million, 4 years, $90 million. Like at what point, what is the breaking point for Tari? And how much are the Rockets ultimately willing to spend to be able to keep him? Because you look at the situation with this team, and, obviously we still don't know what's going to happen with the KD extension, although, the idea is that KD's probably going to be in Houston until he's ready to retire. So at least the next 2 to 3 more years. But what does the Rockets starting lineup look like down the line, right? Is Tari Eason the expected, guy to eventually take over in that starting spot for Kevin Durant, to where eventually you have a starting lineup that features Amen and Tari and Jabari and Sengun as 4 of your 5 starting lineup members, and then potentially even further down the line, Reed Sheppard eventually replacing Fred VanVleet, right? That would be the dream, is that all 5 of these young players, the 5 remaining members of the young core, all become good enough to be starting caliber players, and that the Rockets are still able to contend at a very, very high level, or still be legitimate title contenders with that as their starting lineup, plus, continue to replenish the young talent on the bench, or maybe making a star level trade further down the line for somebody else. So maybe it's not Tari and Jabari in the starting lineup. Maybe one of them still coming off the bench. Who knows? Or they trade for a star level guard and Reed Sheppard's the one coming off the bench. Who knows? For Tari, I kind of feel like his production and how valuable he is to this Rockets team, if they could get him somewhere in the realm of like $22.5 million or less per year on a 4 or 5 year long deal, that's great value for a guy like Tari Eason for what he provides. And you go around the landscape of the NBA and you see what some other role players are commanding, guys that are kind of in the same, cut from the same cloth as a Tari Eason type. Tari could absolutely be a starter on probably like more than half the teams in the NBA. He's coming off the bench for the Rockets, though, because they've got that front court depth. They don't have an available starting spot for Tari Eason. And so that's the thing that's going to kind of artificially hold him back, is unfortunately he doesn't get starters level minutes. He hasn't gotten starters level minutes. So his production numbers aren't as inflated as they might be if he was playing for a team where he was getting 30, 35 minutes a night. And that's absolutely something that I'm guessing the Rockets are using in these negotiations against him, of like, oh, well, your numbers look like this. And, that's when the agent plops down the per 36 numbers and they're like, but look at these. So, you look at a guy like, I don't know, like Jalen Suggs, who commanded, about $30 million a year. And he's, an upper echelon kind of role player for the Orlando Magic. He's obviously their starting point guard. He's not exactly like the best, floor general, table setting, gravity commanding point guard, but he plays elite defense. He's an all NBA caliber defender. He's a knockdown 3-point shooter. And that's maybe like the true like 99th percentile top end for what Tari could possibly command. But Tari's not, a lights out 3-point shooter. He's not a consistent outside shooter. Defensively, he gambles a little bit. He's a great disruptive presence defensively, but he's not quite yet, a true all NBA caliber defender. And there are some limitations to his game, especially in the half court, right? He thrives operating in transition. He thrives, on the defensive side of the ball, creating chaos on that end and then generating extra opportunities. He's a menace on the glass on both sides, defensively and offensively. So how much do you pay a guy like that? I don't subscribe to that notion whatsoever that the Rockets would dangle Tari Eason in a trade unless it was truly for another star level kind of upgrade. Maybe there's a star player that shakes loose in the middle of the season, and that's where the Rockets would be, inclined to include Tari Eason in a trade discussion. But if the Rockets extend Tari Eason, then they can't dangle him in trade talks, right? And I do think that if they were to run the risk of letting Tari Eason get to restricted free agency next summer, there will absolutely be a team out there willing to pay Tari somewhere in the realm of 25 to 30 million a year to possibly even come be a starter for their team. And then the Rockets get screwed into the position of having to match that contract as opposed to just handling their business right here, right now with Tari Eason. And so I think that's probably their best move, and the outcome that's beneficial for both sides is to handle the agreement now, come to terms on a contract, and Tari's camp may just turn their nose up at whatever the Rockets offer, and they may very well feel like he has a chance to get to restricted free agency, get to next summer, and command 25 or $30 million a year annually, and force the Rockets to match any potential offer that comes their way. That might just be the mentality that they decide to take. But at the same time, the market is unpredictable. You never know what teams are going to have money to play with, whether there's going to be a free agency holdup if there's, a top tier free agent or a star player or two that are out there and teams are afraid to move because they're waiting for that money to go elsewhere or waiting to see if they have a shot at a star before committing money to a player like a Tari Eason type. And because of the ramifications of, getting your cap held up on a player for, 72 hours as opposed to just 24 hours or whatever it is on the restricted free agency market, it's a lot tougher to play that restricted free agency battle. Teams are a lot more careful with their money in restricted free agency, and it might not be as easy for Tari Eason to get to next summer and be like, yeah, I can make 25 or $30 million a year easy next summer, right? That this team will pay me and this team will pay me and maybe this team will pay me, and I'll have all these offers rolling in. And weirdly enough, if they did get to next summer and there's still no deal and Tari's a restricted free agent, the Rockets might actually get him for an even cheaper contract than they could get him on right now. So it kind of feels like the pressure is more on Tari's camp to more or less accept whatever contract the Rockets have offered. And I'm assuming that they haven't, they're not going to lowball him and give him 4 years, $60 million. They're not going to hit him with a $15 million a year offer. That would just be insulting. I think that Tari's floor is at least probably $20 million a year annually. And his ceiling is probably $25 million a year. And so if you got him at 5 years, $100 million, or 5 years, 110, whatever, with slight raises each season, that feels like about par for the course for what you'd like for a Tari Eason contract. I feel like the Rockets would view that as a win. I feel like Tari and his camp should view that contract as a win, especially given some of the limitations of his play style, as well as the concerns with how much time he's missed in his NBA career to this point. Being able to get $100 million guaranteed would be a pretty sweet get. Maybe it's something where you sacrifice that final year at the end. Maybe he wants 1 year less on the deal so that he can get out of that contract sooner. Maybe they throw him a player option or something at the end. There's so many different things that can be sprinkled in there. But at the end of the day, I'm confident that the Rockets and that Tari and his camp and his representation will come to terms on a deal before the season ultimately hits. It might just be one that ultimately drags out until closer to the season or closer to the start of the actual season, as opposed to, something that gets hammered out as quickly as the Jabari Smith Jr. deal did. And again, it's because they handled them as two separate, occurrences. They treated Jabari as one thing, Tari as another thing. That's why we haven't heard any updates on the Tari Eason situation, but hopefully we'll get one sooner rather than later. I want your thoughts, though. What would be a good rookie extension for Tari Eason in your eyes? What do you think the Rockets should be trying to pay him for his next contract? How do you feel about the KD contract situation? Do you want to see KD ink a deal? Are you okay with the Rockets going into next season with KD on a 1 year contract and no guarantees that he sticks around long term? Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments. As always, though, thank you so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow the show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.